My name is Louis Coleman. I'm 69, a retired architect. To my son Terrell, I was just a burden he had to manage. I found that out the night I came home a day early and heard my wife crying alone in the living room while my son laughed in the kitchen with his new in-laws. They were measuring my walls. They thought I was a simple old man. They didn't know I was secretly worth $35 million, and they didn't know I'd already built the trap that would end them. The flight from Chicago had been smooth, and I hadn't called ahead. At 69, you don't get many chances to surprise the woman you've loved for 45 years. I turned my key in the lock and the house was too quiet. Then I heard it, a muffled sob from the living room. Diane was curled on the sofa we'd bought in 1985, crying so hard it tore through me. "They're here, Louis," she whispered. "In the kitchen." I walked down the hall toward the laughter. In my kitchen stood my son Terrell holding a tape measure, his wife Heather scribbling notes, and her parents, Richard and Barbara Preston, sipping my whiskey like they owned the place. "This wall has to go," Barbara was saying. "Dated," Richard sniffed at my cabinets. "Oak, pathetic." "Terrell," my voice cut the air. He dropped the tape measure. "Dad, your flight was tomorrow." "I live here," I said. "Why is your mother crying?" Heather stepped forward, hand on her hip. "We're telling you now, Terrell and I are moving in. This house is going to be his anyway." She gestured toward the hall. "You and Diane can move down to the basement. At your age, you don't need the space." The basement. I had designed this house. Laid the tile with Diane myself, and they were dividing it like spoils. "Get out," I said quietly. Richard stepped in with his hedge fund authority. "We know how much Terrell helps you every month. We're just shouldering the burden." Terrell had never given me a dime. I'd never taken one. I turned to my son. "Tell them to leave now." That was the moment of truth. He broke. "Dad, stop making a scene. They're right, this house is too much for you. Heather and I are making the decisions now. Just accept it." Something in me went cold and clear. I saw him, not the boy I'd raised, but a 38-year-old stranger. I walked to the closet, got Diane's coat, helped her into it, and told my son, "You said you were taking over. So take over." I walked her out and pulled the door shut. The click of that lock was the loudest sound of my life. I called my car service. We checked into the Four Seasons, into the presidential suite. The night manager greeted me by name for. Diane was shaking. "Louis, how do they know you here? We don't have this kind of money." I sat her down and told her the truth I'd carried for 20 years. When I sold my architecture patents at 55, I hadn't just retired comfortably. I'd walked away with $24 million. I'd put $20 million into a blind trust I called the Coleman Family Trust, managed by my attorney George Patterson. It had grown to $35 million. I had lived simply on purpose. I'd watched money ruin my partner's kids, and I didn't want that for Terrell. I wanted him to be a man, not an heir. "So you played poor," Diane said, stunned. "I thought I was teaching him responsibility. I was just hiding the target." Then I told her the part that mattered most. The house wasn't ours. It never was. It belonged to the trust. We were tenants. Terrell had just tried to evict the landlord. I called George that night. "It's time," I told him. "Activate Clause 7B. He tried to move us into our own basement. George went silent, then said, "Consider it done. Be in my office at 9. The next morning, in George's glass tower office, he slid a report across the table. Terrell and Heather were $750,000 in debt. Heather spent $300,000 a year the Prestons never actually covered. They believed in appearances, not handouts. Terrell had taken out 22 credit cards and personal loans trying to keep up. Then George told us the real reason. 3 months earlier, Terrell and Richard had walked into my bank with a lawyer and petitioned to have me declared mentally incompetent, citing my modest lifestyle as proof of decline, so Terrell could seize emergency control of the trust. The bank had refused and quietly alerted George. That single act had already triggered Clause 7B, the wolf in sheep's clothing clause. Any beneficiary who committed willful financial or emotional harm against Diane or me would be permanently disinherited, as if he'd never been named at all. Last night's ambush with the tape measures was just Plan B, after Plan A had failed. Terrell no longer had any claim to the $35 million. Everything would pass instead to my niece Monique, a public school nurse in Atlanta who called Diane every Sunday and had once sat by her hospital bed for 3 days after knee surgery, asking nothing in return. She was already flying in. I decided to give them exactly what they wanted. I called Terrell, let my voice break with defeat. "Maybe you're right, son. Come to the lawyer's office at 2. Bring Heather and her parents. I want to sign the house over." He couldn't get there fast enough. At 2 o'clock they arrived, dressed for a coronation, Terrell in an expensive suit bought on credit, Heather glowing like a CEO closing a deal, Barbara dripping gold. Richard already talking about celebratory dinner reservations. George slid across a care and property transfer agreement. Heather barely glanced past the signature line. She and Terrell signed without reading a word, including the fine print acknowledging our diminished capacity and their willing assumption of control. Richard and Barbara signed too, as witnesses attesting to the same thing, thrilled to legally cement the very claim that had already destroyed them. Then I spoke. "There's one small problem. I don't actually own the house." Heather's triumphant face didn't change yet. George explained, "The deed belonged to the Coleman family trust, not to me personally, and had for 20 years. Barbara laughed it off, a trust, from a man who drove a 10-year-old car. George read the valuation aloud. $35,421,000. The room went silent enough to hear the air conditioning. Heather's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, then wild joy. "We're rich," she breathed, throwing her arms around Terrell. "You're not rich," I said. "He's not rich. You get nothing." I explained Clause 7B to my son directly, the bank meeting, the attempt to have me declared incompetent, all of it captured and reported the moment he walked into that bank. "You were disqualified 3 months ago. You just didn't know it. And the document they'd all just signed wasn't a transfer. It was a notarized confession of conspiracy and elder abuse." Richard sputtered about coercion and lawsuits. George only smiled. "Fight it with what? Your client disqualified himself. And he just confessed to it in writing." Heather turned on Terrell. "You idiot, you failed," and fainted onto the rug. Terrell, ignoring his wife on the floor, begged to know who would inherit if not him. I nodded to George, who buzzed the intercom. My niece walked in wearing simple scrubs. "Monique," George said, "is the sole heir to the Coleman family trust, effective 9 a.m. this morning." She laid a single document in front of Terrell, a formal eviction notice. 24 hours to remove their belongings. Anything left behind would be liquidated and donated to elder charity. Then George turned the projector on the rest of them. He traced the debt, 22 cards, payday loans, a second mortgage, to nearly $500,000 in offshore sports betting. Terrell wasn't buying handbags. He was gambling. Heather's face went bone white. Richard tried to distance himself with theatrical disgust, until George put his own finances on the screen. An SEC investigation, a hedge fund quietly insolvent. Client trust accounts being drained to cover his losses. He wasn't wealthy. He was about to be indicted. Barbara turned on him, and George revealed she'd been draining her own 88-year-old mother's retirement account behind everyone's back. The room dissolved into accusations, each of them exposing the other's rot. Heather rounded on Terrell with pure contempt. "You lying, worthless fraud." He fired back about her Maserati, her handbags, her family's own hypocrisy. Richard lunged across the table and George stepped between them. "This is my office, not a courtroom for your family disputes." Heather, calculating even now, told Terrell flatly. He was rich. "You were too stupid to even inherit it right." Terrell pulled off his wedding ring, my own father's ring, and dropped it at her feet. "I'm divorcing you." She flung her own ring at his face and stormed out with her parents, calling for a lawyer and an annulment. That left Terrell alone on the floor, sobbing, a man who'd lost his wife, his in-laws, his house, and $35 million in 15 minutes. George let him break completely before delivering the final blow. The file wasn't just about inheritance. It was evidence, conspiracy to commit elder fraud, attempted bank fraud, forgery, felony elder abuse. Prison, not just poverty. Terrell fell to his knees, begging me not to send my own son away. Diane, who'd been silent through all of it, finally stood over him and asked the only question that mattered. "Why? What did we do to make you hate us?" And the truth came pouring out of him, not hatred but shame. Shame of the modest house, the 10-year-old Honda, the coupons, growing up poor, next to Heather's world of yacht clubs and ski trips. He'd lied to win her, borrowed to keep the lie alive, gambled trying to erase the debt in one big score, and when the lie was about to collapse in front of her parents, he decided to sell our house and put us away rather than let them see the truth. Diane slapped him hard for every sleepless night, every terror, every plan to throw us in our own basement. Then she pulled his head to her chest and held him while he wept, because he was still, impossibly, her son. I sent George and Monique out and laid down the terms myself. Path A, prison for him and the Prestons both. Path B, non-negotiable conditions, 30 days inpatient treatment for the gambling addiction. A real job, earned with his hands, every paycheck applied against the $750,000 he owed the trust, not 1 cent from me again. A permanent restraining order cutting the Prestons and Heather out of his life forever. And the final condition, he would move home, not as our son. As our tenant, in the very basement he'd chosen for us, working as the property's live-in handyman under Monique's ownership until the debt and the family were repaid. He accepted with a single broken nod. 6 months later, the house was lighter than I'd known it could be. Monique and her husband David had moved into the upstairs guest rooms. She was 8 months pregnant, and Diane had thrown herself into grandmothering with a fierce, healing joy. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon again. Terrell lived downstairs, thinner, quieter, working shelves at the local hardware store, coming home every evening at 6, 15 covered in drywall dust. He didn't join us for dinner most nights. That was the arrangement. But Sundays became a ritual Monique insisted on. He was part of the household, so he ate with the household. George called with the final accounting. Richard had been arrested at his golf club. The SEC case had unraveled into a full Ponzi scheme, 20 years minimum. Barbara was broke, living out of a motel. Her attempt to bill the trust for her legal fees answered with an invoice of her own. Heather's divorce lawyer had dropped her case the moment he saw Terrell's real bank balance, $2,100, and she'd already been spotted hunting a new, older target at a museum gala. Some people never learn, I told George. No, he said, they don't, but he is. One evening the kitchen faucet started dripping. At 6:15 I met Terrell at the basement door and told him to fix it. The old spark of entitlement flickered in his eyes and died just as fast. Okay, he said. As I turned to go, I told him there was a plate of his mother's chicken cacciatore waiting on the stove. I heard him choke out a thank you behind me. You're paying your rent, I said, not turning around. For the first time in your life, you're doing it on your own. 2 weeks after that, he found me on the porch with 2 envelopes. The first held his entire paycheck, $512, for Monique and David's baby. The second held $100, the first payment toward the $750,000. I know it's nothing, he said. It'll take 600 years at this rate, I told him. But I put that envelope in my breast pocket over my heart and told him, 1 payment down. I hadn't found the son I wanted. That son, the brilliant, lying, arrogant one, was gone for good, and I'd had to be the one to end him. But sitting on that porch, feeling the crumpled envelope against my chest, hearing Diane's laughter drift through the screen door, I understood I'd found something better. A man learning the hard way how to build a life instead of buying one. I wasn't happy. Happiness was too small a word for it, but for the first time in years I was at peace. What Terrell and the Prestons never understood is the difference between price and value. They chased what things cost and missed what people were worth. True wealth isn't what you can show off. It's the character you build when no one's measuring, and the integrity you keep when everything is on the table.